Ephesians chapter 5, beginning in verse 1, it is written, "Be therefore followers of God as dear children, and walk in love, as Christ also hath loved us, and hath given himself for us an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling savor. But fornication, and all uncleanness, or covetousness, let it not be once named among you as becometh saints, neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor jesting, which are not convenient, but rather giving of thanks. For this ye know, that no whoremonger, nor unclean person, nor covetous man, who is an idolater, hath any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and of God."
Good evening. Good evening. Good to be here with y'all. Have a few visitors, and of course it's always nice to have y'all here with us tonight, and hope that if you are visiting here with us tonight that you travel back to your home safely, and we look forward to seeing you again. We're going to be talking about love tonight because it's come to my attention recently that there are some who believe that we love simply because we're commanded to love. Right, Brent? I was hoping Annette would be here too, but she's not. She's not here tonight, so this lesson, I guess, is pointless now. But no, I'm just kidding. We're going to be talking about specifically walking in love. And, of course, the text that we're reading out of tonight is Ephesians 5 and verse 2. And let's just read that again real quickly so it's fresh on our minds and fresh on my own mind. It says, "Therefore, be imitators of God as dear children, and walk in love, as Christ also has loved us, and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you, as is fitting for saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. For this you know, that no fornicator, unclean person, nor covetous man, who is an idolater, has any inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God." The reason I wanted to talk about this tonight really begins with the fact that we live in a generation today where appearances are so important. We put everything that we can into appearances. We care about mainly how we come across to an individual, whether what we said was the right thing or the wrong thing. We want people to think that we are kind and think that we are loving. And so we get to this point where we put all this effort into appearing to be a certain way when the person that we actually are becomes something that we don't really care about or something that we don't give attention to. The only thing that we begin to care about is what others think about me, what others' opinions are of me. And as long as they're seeing what I want them to see, and as long as their opinion of me is the opinion that I want them to have of me, then I'm okay with that. And we see this in all aspects of life. But one area that we're beginning to see this in, if we aren't careful, is the area of love. The area of love. Because we talk about love, and I think that we have limited what love is nowadays. We've limited love to simply being a face-to-face interaction. And we've limited love to simply showing love. We say that if we show love, then we love. And we understand what it means to show love. We show love through affection or through giving gifts or through doing something unexpectedly nice so that an individual can see, hey, they're putting my needs ahead of their own. When in reality, we can do all those things and not really have love at all, and not really love the individual at all, and not really love God at all. An individual that comes to mind when I was writing this sermon, his name may ring a bell, but you probably know him by another name. But his name is Gary Ridgway. And I was actually reading an article about him tonight, and I'll tell you who he is in a moment. But it was an interview with his son. And his son was reflecting on when he was growing up with his dad, who was Gary Ridgway. And he said, I just remember my dad as just a normal soccer dad, and I don't remember a single time when my dad wasn't there for me. And if you interview his family, because I've seen documentaries on it, all of them had this wonderful vision of who he was. He was just a totally normal individual, a normal person, normal family dad. Well, like I said, Gary Ridgway, he goes by another name, and that name is the Green River Killer. And that comes, Green River, that's from my area, actually in Seattle. There's a Green Lake and Green River. But he's a serial killer. I don't know how else to put it. But he was convicted for around 40 murders. They suspect that he killed up to or over 90 individuals, but he himself doesn't even know what the number is. He lost track, and it's ridiculous. And so all these things come to light. But what I want to impress upon you tonight is that there were absolutely times where this individual showed his family and loved ones affection and gave gifts and did something unexpectedly nice. There were times where he showed love. But in reality, his conduct and the things that he was doing behind the scenes didn't match that of somebody who has love at all. And that's why I want us to notice that Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 2 does not tell us to show love. It tells us to walk in love. First thing that we have to ask ourselves is, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to walk in love? What does it mean to walk in love? It comes from the Greek word peripateo, and guess what it means? It means to walk. That is when it's used in the literal sense, but it's also used in a figurative sense as it is here. And Vines renders that in that scenario, it renders it as signifying the whole round of the activities of the individual life, whether of the unregenerate or of the believer. So in other words, if you're walking in blank, whatever it is that you're walking in, it's talking about every single aspect of your life. Every activity that you do. And so when we talk about walking in love, we have to have love in every aspect of our life. Everything that we do, every activity that we partake in, we have to ask ourselves if we're doing it in love. And love has to be consistent in our character no matter what. Because what we come to find is that it's far too easy to simply just show love. Think about Judas. We all know Judas. You know, Judas was one of the 12 apostles. And I think we kind of skew things here because here's Judas, and he was a 12 apostle. And yes, Jesus knew who was going to betray him. But guess what? His apostles didn't know. And I find that interesting because we read through the Bible, and every time I see Judas's name, I just have this picture of a guy that he's so obviously evil. But that wasn't obvious to the apostles. He conducted himself and showed himself in a way that the apostles just thought he was one of the apostles. But we know him as what? We know him today as the one who betrayed the Son of God. Of course, how did he do that? How did he go about betraying the Son of God? Let's look back to that in Luke 22, 47 through 48. In Luke 22, 47 and 48, we get to this point where Jesus is about to be taken captive here. And it says in 47 through 48, it says, "And while he was still speaking, behold, a multitude. And he who was called Judas, one of the 12, went before them and drew near to Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, 'Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?'" It's far too easy to do that. And we look at that and we wonder, why did Judas do that? Why did Judas go about betraying the Son of Man? Because we all know how he set it up. He said, the one that I go and kiss is the one who is Jesus. And that's how the whole thing was going to unravel. And that's how they were going to know it was Jesus and take him prisoner. But why did Judas want to do it that way? To me, the reason that he wanted to do that was because he wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He wanted to get that money for betraying Jesus, but he also didn't want Jesus to realize that it was him who was betraying him. And he also didn't want his apostles to realize that it was him who was betraying him. He wanted his apostles to look at him as somebody who loved Jesus also, and just another one of the apostles. And maybe the apostles didn't know before this happened that Judas was the one that was going to betray them. But Jesus knew. And that's why he called him on it. He said, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? We do this all the time in all aspects of life. We do it even just when we're going up to greet somebody. I can go up to somebody and say, hey, Brent, how's it going? And give them a handshake and say, it's so nice to see you. And it's been so long since I see you. I'm so happy to see you. And then I walk away and I go, hate that guy. Just kidding. I love you. You know I do. Because I'm commanded to. We do that all the time, though, don't we? We fake these interactions, and communication becomes a very fake thing, and relationships can become a very surface level thing. And so I just want to ask you, as I ask myself, are we betraying God or our brother with a kiss? Of course, I'm speaking metaphorically, thank goodness. But it's interesting. I want us to look again at Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 3 through 5. And what's interesting to me, actually I want to start in verse 2. And I know we're going to get a little repetition here, but that's okay. It says, and walk in love, as Christ also has loved us, and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. But fornication and all uncleanness or covetousness, let it not even be named among you, as is fitting for saints. Neither filthiness, nor foolish talking, nor coarse jesting, which are not fitting, but rather giving of thanks. For this you know, that no fornicator, unclean person, nor covetous man who is an idolater has any inheritance in the kingdom of God. It's interesting to me because here we're reading about love, which we just limit to being this interaction or even sometimes just an emotion that we have. And he's talking about love, and then all of a sudden he says, love is Christ loved, and then he goes on and starts talking about fornication, uncleanness, covetousness. He talks about filthiness, foolish talking, coarse jesting. And you read that and you think, what does that have to do with walking in love? And my answer to you to that question is exactly. What does any of that have to do with love? The answer is it has nothing to do with love. So the only thing that I can conclude from that is that our conduct matters when it comes to love. The way we conduct ourselves in our daily lives matters. And in a moment, my next point you see is we need to love just as he loved us. And it's interesting also that it says that Jesus offered himself as a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. And then if we go over to Romans 12 and verse 1 through 2, it says, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And what does it say right after he tells us to present our bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service? The very next thing he says, and do not be conformed to the world. Conduct matters. Again, I ask you, are you betraying God or your brother with a kiss? Acting one way in their presence, acting an entirely different way in their absence. How do you act at work? How do you act at school? How do you act when you're with this group of friends as opposed to your group of friends from church? Do your actions match your thoughts, and vice versa? Here's a scary thing to consider. Scenario I'd like to set up for you. If somebody believed that you loved them, somebody that you told on your daily basis, hey, I love you, somebody that believes that you love them, were able to be a fly on the wall and observe you all day without your knowledge, what would they witness? Would they witness someone who loved them? Would they still feel loved? It's a scary thing to consider. And we look at that and we say, thank goodness that's not the case. But the reality of the matter is it is the case, because God is watching us and he's seeing everything we do. He hears every word we say, every action that we perform. no matter what group we were with, whether we're at church or whether we're at our jobs. God sees all and hears all. But again, what do they see? What does God see? Do they see someone who loves them? Or do they see hypocrisy? Romans 12 and verse 9 says, "Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil, cling to what is good." Let love be without hypocrisy. Well, how do we do that? Well, we abhor what is evil and we cling to what is good. So are you abhorring what is evil and clinging to what is good, or are you clinging to what is evil and abhorring what is good? Let your love be without hypocrisy. Just as Jesus' love was without hypocrisy. There's nothing hypocritical about Jesus, especially his love. And that's why we need to love just as he loved us, just as Jesus loved us. Of course, when it comes to the life that Jesus lived, we know that he was without sin. In 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 21, it says, "For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us." It's talking about Jesus, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Have you ever thought about, because I think about, sometimes you play this little game in your head and you're thinking, like, how many times have I sinned in my life? Or how many times have I sinned this week? Or how many times have I sinned today or this month or whatever it may be? And I've been alive for 24 years, and I just can't imagine how big that number is. But then I started thinking about Christ, and he was perfect and he was sinless. And you start thinking about every single moment, every single time he made the right decision, every single time he looked sin in the eye and he didn't give in to it. Fact of the matter is, we required a perfect sacrifice. And that's what Jesus was dedicated to being. And that's something that he was mindful of. And therefore, I can conclude, and I have no shame in feeling that every single good decision that God made, he made it because he loved me. Every time he overcame sin, it was because he loved me. And because he acknowledged the fact that these people need a perfect sacrifice to redeem them from their sins. Of course, since he was perfect, then it's obvious that his behavior was consistent regardless of the circumstances that he found himself in. And we know that he was tempted. Hebrews 4:15 tells us that. In all points he was tempted, and yet remained sinless. And then you consider Matthew 4, 1 through 11, and I'm not going to read through that, but we all know that that's where Jesus goes out to the wilderness, and what's the scenario there? Well, he's by himself. He's by himself. There's nobody there to look at him and be disappointed. There's nobody there to stop him from sinning, but that didn't matter. He was going to overcome sin no matter what, whether he was in front of people or alone or whatever the situation was. He just decided that sin was not going to be something that he was going to give into. Jesus' conduct in this life tells me that he loved us and that he loved me. It's why our conduct is an aspect of love. We ask ourselves, why is our conduct an aspect of love? Well, for starters, because our conduct can benefit others. You ever thought about that before? Your conduct can benefit others. A couple ways that come to mind. Well, first of all, how about peace of mind when one of us passes away? 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, 13 through 14, we read about that. It says, "But I do not want you to be ignorant, brethren, concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so God will bring with him those who sleep in Jesus." So the first thing I want us to look at here is that Paul doesn't say that we're just not going to sorrow over the people that we love that passed away. But rather what he's saying is that I don't want you to sorrow in the same way that people who have no hope sorrow. So yes, we're going to sorrow, but you know what? We get to sorrow in hope. And we have hope that knowing that the ones that we love who also loved Christ and were also faithful Christians, we have hope knowing that they aren't perishing. And we have hope knowing that we'll have a chance to see him again. And that to me is so considerate of the people who have gone on before me, that they allow me not to have to worry about that. I've talked about this several times before, and one man that I looked up to so very much was my grandfather, my grandpa Lowell. He was a minister for 65 years. And he died in March. And now I'm a preacher, and I had never talked to him about being a preacher before he died. And so now that I'm getting into this, I often reflect and just kind of wish that he was here so I could have conversations with him that I didn't get to have with him while he was here. And just a month ago, I was reflecting and just thinking about him. And when you do that, you start asking yourself silly questions like, what did they really think about me? Because I was kind of at this life, all my brothers had their things figured out, and my grandpa was able to see how all his grandchildren turned out, but I was still at this point in my life where I was figuring things out, and I just started thinking, what did he think about me? And that question comes into your mind, even though it's a foolish question, but did he love me? And of course, I know that he did. But I got this email from my dad, and he had found this letter that my grandfather had written to me the day I was born. And the idea of our conduct benefiting others, I just want to read to you the last paragraph that he wrote. And it just wouldn't mean as much to me if he hadn't lived a faithful life and if he hadn't conducted himself in a faithful manner. And it's just amazing when I read this. But yeah, anyways, he says to me, remember that there is only one message that has come from heaven to earth, and that message is contained in the Bible. If you take the Bible only, it will make Christians only. If you speak where the Bible speaks and are silent where the Bible is silent, then you will be like the people in the Bible. I have based my life on those principles, as also your mom and dad and Grammy are doing. I have every confidence that it will lead me from earth to heaven, and I do want it to lead you there also. Be faithful, my son. Be faithful, and I will see you on the other side of death. I love you, your Grandpa Lowell. I started talking about this idea of love and showing love, and one of those things is that we do to show love is we give gifts. All right, well, let's talk about that for a second. Let's talk about giving gifts. If you want to give somebody the greatest gift imaginable, a gift that they'll always know that you love them, even when you're gone, love God. Love God and lead a faithful life and give an example of what it means to be faithful and a dedicated Christian. That's the absolute greatest gift that you can give anybody. And if you do that also, if you dedicate your life to being faithful, because I often look at this and I reflect on that, and I reflect on his life and just what a good Bible student he was. And he reminds me a lot of Brent. I mean, he does. He was a really good student. But when you do that and when you live a dedicated life, it inspires others to be better. Philippians 4 and verse 9, Paul talks about this and kind of has this principle, and that's what Paul was all about. He's all about leading by example. It says, the things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you. Now understand we have to be careful here because he's an inspired apostle. And I'm not suggesting that somebody should come up here and say, everything I do and everything I say, these do also. That's not what I'm saying. But what I want to suggest to you is just because Paul was an inspired apostle. I don't believe that being inspired takes away free will. And there are plenty of things that Paul did and set an example that were his choice and not necessarily because he was inspired. Yes, God was certainly with him in those scenarios and delivered him time and time again. But he chose to serve God. And we see during his ministries, he's beaten to the point where people think he's dead. And I mean, he's just facing death on a regular basis and is imprisoned and eventually is beheaded, as historical accounts tell us. All for what? For the faith. And we look at that and we're so impressed by that. And we take so much from that. But imagine the people living in that day, following the narrative of Paul and all the persecution that they were about to encounter. And they see Paul, who quite clearly loves all these churches that he's going around and establishing because he's willing to die in order to do it. I mean, that's why he did it. He did it because he was walking in love, and he wanted to take as many souls with him as he absolutely, possibly could. His love had no circumstance. It wasn't based on circumstance. It just was there. And he did what he was going to do. Because that's what true love is all about. True love doesn't have circumstance. I think about Jesus. Jesus' love certainly wasn't based off of circumstance. And in fact, his conduct proves that he loves us time and time again. What's one thing that he said in John 15:13? He says, "Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." And you talk about walking the walk and talking the talk. Christ's love wasn't circumstantial when he was facing death. It was there. His love existed even without the guarantee of recognition, as Jesus died. People accused him of being a criminal and a liar and spitting on him. They didn't recognize him as the Messiah. And yet he did it anyways. Because love exists without the guarantee of self-benefits. And that's something that we see in 1 Corinthians 13:5. It says, of love, it says, does not seek its own. When it's going through and giving that whole list of what love is. Love does not seek its own. Because that's what we're all about. We're all about seeking our own. And that's what love has become about. It's been about, okay, yeah, I'll be part of this relationship and I'll show love to you and I'll love you, but as long as you're reciprocating that and giving me the warm and fuzzies, but as long as you stop doing that, then guess what? I'm out. That's not what real love is. That's not what the example that Christ gave us. Love at times even exists when it's not wanted. There were plenty of people who were not interested in the things that Jesus was talking about and the things that Jesus was preaching at that time. And there are plenty of people who still aren't interested. And yet what did he do anyways? He died. He died for our sins. He walked in love. He lived a perfect life for us. And those people today who aren't interested, he doesn't take away the opportunity. If that individual one day wants to repent and obey the gospel, that's there for them. Even though right now it may not be wanted. But that's just what true love is. That's what walking in love is. Love exists regardless of who we're with or where we are. I just want us to turn our attention to Peter and looking at a man who kind of gave in to a situation where he was around certain people and peer pressure and denied Jesus. And he was a man that got another chance, wasn't he? And I thought about just kind of paraphrasing this and talking through it, but I want to read through it. So I want to start off in Luke 22:54 through 62. It says, having arrested him, Speaking of Jesus. They led him and brought him into the high priest's house. But Peter followed at a distance. Now when they had kindled a fire in the midst of the courtyard and sat down together, Peter sat among them. And a certain servant girl, seeing him as he sat by the fire, looked intently at him and said, "This man was also with him." But he denied him, saying, "Woman, I don't know him." And after a little while another saw him and said, "You are also of them." But Peter said, "Man, I am not." Then after about an hour had passed, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Surely this fellow also was with him, for he is a Galilean." But Peter said, "Man, I do not know what you are saying." Immediately, while he was still speaking, the rooster crowed. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Then Peter remembered the word of the Lord, how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." So Peter went out and wept bitterly. So we have this scenario where Jesus tells him, "You're going to deny me 3 times," and Peter just promises that that's just not going to be the case. And of course, we see Jesus was right. Peter did deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed. And I just think about that, Jesus turning around and then making eye contact, and Peter just immediately, just like, what have I done? And then we get to John chapter 21. And we see, as far as we know, this first intimate conversation after Christ has been risen going on between Peter and Christ. And it's interesting because you know that this scenario is in Peter's head. And picking up in verse 15 of John 21, it says, "So when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, 'Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said to him, 'Feed my lambs.' He said to him again a second time, 'Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?' He said to him, 'Yes, Lord, you know that I love you.' He said to him, 'Tend my sheep.' He said to him the third time, 'Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me?' Peter was grieved because he said to him the third time, 'Do you love me?' And he said to him, 'Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you.' Jesus said to him, 'Feed my sheep. Most assuredly I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish.' This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him," and I want you to pay attention to what Jesus says. He says, "Follow me." Peter isn't going to prove to Jesus that he loves him simply by telling him 3 times in a row, "Yes, I love you." The way that he's going to prove that is by following Jesus through his conduct, which eventually will lead to death. See, walking in love means that we're following Jesus. It means that we're walking behind him. You can't walk in Jesus and walk in love, and not walk in love. Or you can't walk in love and not walk in Jesus. The 2 things go together. Walking in love and following Jesus. Now consider for a second who we're following. In 1 John 4:8, what does he say about God? He says that God is love. He doesn't say that God showed love, or he had an appearance of love, or he was a shadow of love, but he says God is love. The problem is we're getting too wrapped up in how we're going to show love, or how we're going to have the appearance of love, or how we're going to convince others that we love them. When maybe what we should be doing is focusing on how we too can be love. How can I be love? Is that a characteristic that is within me? Is that how somebody would describe me? Is that how I would describe myself? And so when you ask what that means, I want us to look at what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, and starting in verse 4, which is, again, a passage that we're very familiar with. But what I want you all to do, and what I do as well, is I look at this and I read it, and I ask myself, are these things that I am? Are these things that are consistent with who I am and how I'm conducting myself on a daily basis? And so in verse 4, am I suffering long? Am I kind? Do I not envy? Do I not parade myself? Am I not puffed up? Do I not behave rudely? Do I not seek my own? Am I not provoked? Do I think no evil? Do I not rejoice in iniquity, but rejoice in truth? Do I bear all things? Do I believe all things? Do I hope all things? Do I endure all things? Do I never fail? I know that as I read through that, I fall short in just about every area. But what we need to do is we need to lean on God, and we need to work on making these things consistent in our everyday life. Not simply showing these things, but being these things. Because love is more than a face-to-face interaction. But you can love God and love others simply by bettering yourself in accordance to His will. So if you want to begin to follow Jesus and walk in love, you can start that journey by being baptized here tonight. And if you have any other spiritual need, please come forward while we stand and sing the song of invitation.